Hello, I'm Dr. Roush. I'm your instructor for History 121, World Civilizations to 1600. In this video, we're just going to be introducing the course. So what is it that we will study in this course? Well, it's called World Civilizations, but of course we cannot possibly study the entire world. Instead of trying to get everything in, we're going to focus on civilizations that have been particularly influential in history. For example, the Roman Empire, China, African civilizations, India. We will also focus on connections between civilizations, and we will focus on comparisons, how civilizations are similar and therefore represent something we share as human beings, and how they're different, and that shows us a little bit about cultural difference. I'm going to attempt to be as representative as possible considering time constraints, right? We only have one semester to talk about human history from the beginnings to the year 1600, so that's why I have to focus on civilizations that have been particularly influential. I'll do my best to get in as much as possible from a lot of different civilizations. Now, a question I think people could reasonably ask is, why study this? Why look at really old history? Why try and study the time period all the way from human beginnings till 1600? And I have several ways I would answer that question. I think, though, central is that it's key to understanding the world we live in, right? Early world history helps us to better understand the world we live in. So, for example, this image you probably recognize as the Lincoln Memorial, right? You can see Lincoln here, and that's naturally what you're going to focus on. But you'll notice that there's a certain architectural style that was adapted here, and that is a kind of Greco-Roman architectural structure. And that's because when the people who started the United States were trying to figure out how to establish a democracy, a republic that would last, they looked to Greek and Roman models to try and figure out how to do that. So when you think about the institutions that govern our country, it's based on lessons learned from what was going on in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And those were systems that had representative government, that had democracy. Greek had democracy. The Romans had a republic. And that they did well for a time, and then they failed. They fell apart. They declined. We'll talk about that in this class. And so one thing that the people who started the United States had to figure out was, okay, how do we fix the problems they have had and show how we can make a democracy that will work, that won't fall apart? So if we want to better understand the United States, it helps us to understand this ancient history. To give us another example, this is the when Supreme Court justices enter the Supreme Court, or anyone goes in the Supreme Court for that matter, they will pass. There's multiple entrances, and one of the entrances has these three figures. Right, this is a Greek philosopher. This is Confucius, who we will talk a lot about. We will also talk a lot about Greek philosophers, and that's Moses with the Ten Commandments. So I think it's interesting that the Supreme Court building has these figures all around it representing great lawgivers from history. The laws that we use and the problems that we face that laws were developed to deal with have a lot to do with ancient history, which is why they have commemoration outside of the Supreme Court building of these figures. And people who are lawyers, people who are judges, they know this history, and it impacts how they make legal decisions. So the court cases that could impact you are made by people who are literally walking under these images of these lawgivers and who are reflecting on them as they make decisions that affect and impact our lives. Likewise, in this early world history, we are better able to understand the world we live in because we'll be looking at the development of pretty much every major world religion. So in this class, we will talk about the development of Islam, of Buddhism, of Hinduism, of Christianity, and Judaism, right? The majority of the world's population belongs to one of these religions, and even if you don't belong to one of these religions, it still impacts history, right? Whenever you look at the news, a lot of times there's something that has to do with religion. So those are some examples, right, of how things that happened in the ancient past impact us today. But also to continue, my hope is that by looking at this ancient history, we can be inspired. We can say, you know what? Egyptians, they had relatively limited technology. They didn't have internal combustion engines. They didn't have cranes or bulldozers. And wow, they built the pyramids. That is impressive, right? That is impressive. And I should note that a lot of the people who built the pyramids, we have this image that it was typically slaves that did that. That's actually kind of a misunderstanding. The Hebrews, for example, ancient Hebrews did not build the pyramids. They built treasure houses. They were often wage laborers, people who were paid a wage. But the key thing what I want people to get out of this, right, is that people in the past, often with very limited tools, limited technology, did amazing things. And you can see that in the pyramids that are still standing this day. We'll talk more about them later. But to me, this is inspiring, especially when we face difficulties. To give you another example, two figures that we'll talk a lot about in this class. One is Socrates, a brilliant Greek philosopher who was one of the first people, in a sense, to develop a method for thinking critically and asking questions, asking good questions. And I think he's an inspiring figure, in fact, because basically he kept asking so many questions that people got sick of him, they killed him. We'll talk more about that story later. But he was someone whose love of truth and virtue led him to ask questions even when it could harm him, right? He put truth and virtue ahead of his own life. This is a modern representation of Amane-Renas. Amane-Renas was an African queen who lived around the 1st century AD. Her kingdom was south of Egypt, which was under Roman control, and the Romans tried to invade, basically, and take over her kingdom, and she fought them back and was able to preserve her country's independence. Again, very inspiring, right? This African queen facing the most powerful empire at the time was able to preserve their independence. And one thing we'll talk about with the Romans, usually if they wanted a piece of territory, they got it, right? But she was able to fight them off. Now, this next part is not as inspiring, I guess, but we do have to deal with reality. One thing we'll see in this class is that there's a lot of conflict. There's conflict within civilizations. There's conflict between civilizations. One constant, unfortunately, in a sense, in human history has been warfare. People fighting and killing each other and hurting each other. That's something that has continued from the ancient time till today. So a large part of this class is we're going to seek to learn about different civilizations to better understand the world and what we can do to reduce conflict so we can get along as well as possible. Sometimes you're just going to have conflict because people want different things. But sometimes conflict is just caused by misunderstandings. People see the world differently. They understand culture differently. And if we can at least get a better understanding of each other, we can prevent some conflict at least. I don't think we can prevent it all, but we can prevent some. And of course, it's just interesting learning about other people and learning about how to think about the world differently. And that's one thing to kind of think about history and how it impacts contemporary American society. And just on a personal note, this is me right here. This is my wife. My wife is Filipino. I'm Caucasian, so our sons are biracial. That's them there. And then this is a good friend of ours who was a Lander alumni from Korea. That's her visiting us. And, I'm consider myself very fortunate. I got to teach this class. I've got to get to know people from a lot of different countries. Korea is my specialty. I speak some Korean and I do my research there. And that's really been something that's enriched my life. And it's my hope that that will enrich your lives too, right? It's not simply that what we learn has to be useful. Sometimes it's just cool to know stuff. But that being said, one thing that I think makes this course very important for contemporary American society is when we think about American democracy and our diversity, right? The United States is arguably the most diverse nation on earth, right? There's all sorts of different people, all sorts of different cultures, all sorts of different religions, all different sorts of worldviews in our country. And one thing I would argue, I think that's really a strength in our country. When everyone sees the world in the exact same way, it's hard to be creative. And if you look at a lot of American dominant, say, in popular culture, in the world of music or in movies, you can see how there's all sorts of different influences from all sorts of different people. And so in the United States, I think one reason we're such a dynamic country, one reason why we're leaders in science and popular culture, and of course history, is because of that dynamism, because we have all these different people with all these different perspectives, talking to each other, communicating with each other, sharing their ideas, and synthesizing something cool new out of them. However, with this diversity, because we have different perspectives, that can also lead to misunderstanding and conflict. I said a little bit about that a bit before. But by understanding each other, including what we have in common and what is different, we can resolve these conflicts for the good of all, right? We'll talk about this more as this class goes on, but one thing that's very important about democracy is that, at least in theory, it's supposed to help us get together, talk, compromise, deal with our issues so we can bring positive change without fighting, like literal fighting, like killing each other. That's the idea. We can do that through democracy, but we have to understand each other to do that. And like I said, we're this very diverse country with people from all over the world. So understanding world civilizations would be very helpful for our democracy now, wouldn't it? Right? If we can better understand how people think and why they think and how we've been shaped by these ancient civilizations, that can help us better understand each other and resolve the problems we face in a way that's good for everyone and do it peacefully. To do that, we need understanding, patience, and compromise, and knowledge is necessary for this to work. I have to understand other people's ideas. That takes patience, right? It's not easy to understand someone else's perspective. And then once I understand, I have to be like, okay, what can I give? What can they give? So we can come up with some kind of compromise that will work. Now, no one knows what the future will bring, but learning about the past will help prepare you to meet any challenges that come your way. So I hope in this course you will work hard, learn, and through your education later on, and of course today as well, you could help make this world a better place for everyone.